The rain fell softly on the Buckingham Palace forecourt, a gray London drizzle that matched the mood inside the gilded carriage. Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales, sat ramrod straight, the weight of the crown on her shoulders feeling heavier than the velvet and diamonds adorning her person. Beside her, the carriage swayed gently, carrying her back from the solemn Remembrance Day service. Her gloved hand rested on the seat, perfectly still, but beneath the fabric, her knuckles were white. Her gaze was fixed on the window, but she wasn't seeing the wet streets of London or the crowds who had long since dispersed. She was seeing something else entirely. A vision from earlier that day, a secret she now carried that was so volatile, so deeply damaging, it made the ancient stones of the palace feel unsteady beneath her feet. It had started as a moment of shared humanity. On the balcony of the Foreign Office, she and Queen Camilla had stood side by side, two women bound by marriage to the most scrutinized family in the world. They had watched the solemnity below, the old soldiers, the young royals, laying wreaths, the 2-minute silence that hung over the nation. Kate, ever observant, had noticed a slight tremor in Camilla's hand as she held her order of service. For a fleeting second, the public mask had slipped, and Kate had seen not the queen, but an elderly woman feeling the chill of November and the weight of years. Leaning over, she had broken the silence with a simple, human question. Lip readers would later decipher it for the world's media. "Did you see it?" she had asked, a soft smile on her lips, referring to a minor, an almost comical misstep by an official below, a moment of unintentional levity in the midst of profound solemnity. Camilla had turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes before a genuine, unguarded smile touched her lips. She had lifted her order of service to her face, a gesture the press would interpret as her hiding a laugh, a moment of shared feminine conspiracy against the backdrop of rigid protocol. But Kate, standing so close, had seen what the long-lens cameras could not. Behind the program, Camilla's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a brittle, fragile thing. And in that fleeting second, as the Queen's guard was down, she had whispered something back. Not the reply to Kate's question, but something else entirely. 4 words, raw and unvarnished, that had nothing to do with the ceremony below. It is so heavy." Kate's breath had caught in her throat. It wasn't the order of service she meant. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, had darted to the glittering crown upon Camilla's head. It was a whisper of vulnerability so profound, so unexpected, that it had pierced Kate's own carefully constructed armor. For 12 years since her wedding to William in 2011, she had navigated the treacherous currents of this family. She had concealed her feelings, smiled through feuds, and absorbed the slights. The rumor had always been there, that Camilla from the very beginning viewed her with a jealousy that bordered on obsession, that she saw Kate's youth, her popularity, and her untainted link to the future as a direct threat. Kate had felt the subtle snubs, the cold shoulders, the invitations that never came. And she had mastered the art of the passive-aggressive curtsy, or the pointed lack thereof, as she had famously done at the coronation, a silent rebellion that had sent ripples through the household. But in that whisper, the game had changed. The carefully constructed villain, the Rottweiler, as some tabloids had dubbed her, had vanished. In her place was a woman drowning, and in that moment of shared humanity, Camilla had entrusted Kate with a key, not to a room, but to the lockbox of her own soul. As the carriage now swayed on its journey back, Kate replayed those words. She thought of her own secret, the one she had discovered just days before, a piece of information so potent it could, if wielded carelessly, shatter the fragile peace of the monarchy. It was Camilla's concealed secret, and it was far heavier than a crown. The palace, for Kate, was no longer a home. It was a powder keg, and she was sitting on top of it, holding the match. The carriage passed through the gilded gates, the gravel crunching beneath the wheels. As the footman moved to open the door, Kate took a deep breath. She was no longer just the smiling Duchess. She was the keeper of two secrets now: the Queen's vulnerability and the truth she had yet to confront. The palace walls, for all their thickness, suddenly felt as though they were made of glass, quivering on the edge of a shattering revelation. She stepped out, her heels clicking on the wet stone, the cold air biting her cheeks. The Game of Thrones, she realized, was not won with swords, but with whispers. And the quietest whisper, she had just learned, was often the deadliest. At the private apartments of the Prince and Princess of Wales at Kensington Palace were a world away from the state formality of Buckingham. Yet, on the evening after the Remembrance Day service, the atmosphere within was just as tense. Kate had dismissed their personal assistant early, a rare occurrence that signaled to William that something was gravely amiss. She sat in the armchair by the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows across her worried face. She was still in her black morning coat, the poppy still pinned to her lapel, as if she hadn't had the strength to shed the day's armor. William poured himself a whiskey, the clink of the decanter the only sound in the room. He studied his wife. He knew every line of her face, every flicker of emotion she tried to hide. He saw the storm behind her eyes. "It was more than just a look, wasn't it?" he asked quietly, sitting opposite her, on the balcony. "The papers are already spinning it as a moment of mirth between you two." He tried a small, hopeful smile. Kate finally looked at him, and the raw honesty in her gaze made his blood run cold. "She's terrified, William," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Not of the public, not of the press. Of him, of your father." William's hand froze, the whiskey glass halfway to his lips. "That's ridiculous. She's his rock. They're joined at the hip." Kate leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "She told me. Not in so many words, but she whispered something. She said the crown is so heavy." She wasn't talking about the diamonds, Will. She was talking about the burden, the constant, suffocating burden of keeping him stable. She paused, choosing her next words with surgical precision. "I saw something last week, when I was at Clarence's house, picking up the charity papers from her private study." This was it, the secret she had been holding. William's face paled. "You shouldn't have been in her study. I was lost, and a footman directed me to the wrong door," Kate said, waving away the technicality. "I walked in for a second before I realized, and on her desk, half hidden under a blotter, was a letter. It was from a specialist, a neurologist." She let the word hang in the air, heavy with implication. William set his glass down untouched. "You're reading private medical correspondence now?" "I'm reading the writing on the wall," she shot back, her voice gaining strength. "The king has been forgetful. We've all seen it. The confusion at events, the repeating of phrases. The palace calls it exhaustion. But this letter wasn't about exhaustion. It was a diagnosis, William. An early, private diagnosis. And Camilla is hiding it." The silence in the room was absolute. The crackling fire sounded like a roar. William ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. A diagnosis of cognitive decline in a reigning monarch was more than a family tragedy. It was a constitutional crisis. It would trigger questions of regency, of fitness to rule, a seismic shock to the institution. "Why would she hide it?" he breathed, more to himself than to her. But he knew the answer before he even asked. Power. Legacy. Camilla had spent a lifetime fighting for a ring on her finger and a crown on her head. To have it all snatched away by a cruel twist of biology, and to have her husband declared unfit so soon after finally achieving his destiny, would be a humiliation too far. She was buying time. Time for Charles to have his moment. Time for her to solidify her position. Time to manage the narrative. "She's protecting him," Kate said, though her tone was not entirely sympathetic. "She's also protecting herself, but the weight of it will. I saw it in her eyes today. It's crushing her. She had a moment of weakness and she let it slip. To me, of all people." William stood up, pacing the room. The political implications were staggering. If this got out, the government would be involved. The Prime Minister, the Privy Council. There would be headlines. The King's darkest secret. Camilla's cover-up. The tabloids would have a field day, and the fragile reputation of the monarchy, that painstakingly rebuilt since the dark days of Diana's death, would be torn apart. "We have to tell someone," he finally said, his back to her. "Who?" Kate asked, her voice sharp. "Your grandmother is gone. The only person who could have guided this family through a storm like this is no longer here." She was referring to the late Queen, the great stabilizer. "If we go to the palace establishment, they will close ranks. They'll deny it. They'll find a way to discredit us, to paint it as a power grab. They'll say I'm just the jealous Duchess trying to undermine the Queen." She stood up and walked to him, placing a hand on his arm. "She gave me her secret today, Will. Not intentionally, but she gave it to me. I didn't ask for this, but now I have it. And I can't unknow it. The palace is built on secrets, but this one is different. And this one could bring the walls down." The days that followed were a masterclass in royal deception. Breakfast was eaten with forced smiles. Public engagements were fulfilled with robotic precision. But in the privacy of their home, Kate and William existed in a bubble of hushed, frantic conspiracy. The knowledge of the king's condition sat between them like a third person at the dinner table. Kate found herself studying Camilla with new eyes at every subsequent event. She saw the way the Queen subtly guided the king's hand, the way she leaned in to murmur reminders in his ear, the fleeting look of panic in her eyes when he faltered for a word during a minor speech. It was all there, hiding in plain sight, once you knew what to look for. The tension reached its breaking point during a small private family dinner at Windsor Castle, and it was meant to be a warm-up for the Christmas festivities, a chance for the Waleses, the Edinburghs, and the King and Queen to be together. The conversation was stilted, the food exquisite but tasteless on Kate's tongue. She watched as Camilla, seated at the opposite end of the table, constantly monitored Charles. She saw the king push a complex piece of cutlery away in frustration, and Camilla smoothly reach over and solve the puzzle for him, patting his hand with a smile that was both loving and desperately sad. Later in the drawing room, the men drifted to one end to discuss politics, leaving the women with their coffee. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, was recounting a story about a charity visit, her voice a pleasant hum in the background. Kate, however, was focused on Camilla, who sat staring into the fire, and her coffee cup forgotten in her hands, growing cold. The mask was down. She looked every one of her years and more. Kate made a decision. This silent complicity was untenable. She excused herself, claiming a need for fresh air, and stepped out onto a small, secluded balcony. The winter air was a shock, clean and cold. A moment later, she heard the door open and close behind her. She didn't need to turn around. "You know, don't you?" Camilla's voice came from behind her, quiet, devoid of its usual public warmth. It was a statement, not a question. Kate turned. Camilla stood there, wrapped in a pashmina, her face illuminated by the soft light spilling from the window. She looked resigned, a fox finally at bay. "I saw the letter," Kate admitted, her voice equally quiet. "By accident. In your study." Camilla closed her eyes for a second, a tiny, almost imperceptible flinch. When she opened them, they were clear and hard. "And what do you intend to do with this accident, Catherine? Run to the press? Enhance your own popularity by exposing the frailties of the old?" The accusation stung, but Kate held her ground. "I'm not my mother-in-law," she said, a pointed reference to the way Diana had used the media. "I have no desire to destroy this family, but I have a duty to my husband, to my children. They are the future. Their future cannot be built on a lie." "A lie?" Camilla's voice rose slightly, cracking with emotion. "You think protecting a man's dignity, allowing him to fulfill the one destiny he has waited his entire life for, is a lie? You, who have had the world at your feet since the day you snared a prince at a fashion show." The venom in her voice was unexpected, the old jealousy bubbling to the surface. "I didn't snare anyone," Kate retorted, her own temper flaring. "And I am not your enemy. I'm trying to understand. But you have to see that this cannot go on. The business of the country, it's too important." Camilla laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "The business of the country. You sound like the courtiers. They don't care about Charles. They care about the machine. And I care about my husband. My husband, who wakes up in the night confused and afraid. My husband who looks to me to be his memory, his strength, his anchor." Her voice broke. "You think the crown is heavy? The weight of a man's entire being, his sanity, his legacy, yet resting solely on your shoulders? That is a weight no tiara could ever match." The two women stood on the balcony, the distance between them a mere few feet. But the gulf of history, of rivalry, of pain, was immeasurable. Kate finally understood. This wasn't a power grab. This was a desperate last-ditch act of love from a woman who had been vilified for most of her life. Camilla was not trying to save the monarchy. She was trying to save her husband from the humiliation of having it taken away from him. "What do you want from me?" Kate asked, her voice soft. Camilla looked at her, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I want time. Just a little more time. Let him have Christmas. Let him have a new year. Let the world see him as king, strong and capable for just a while longer. When the time is right, we will manage it, together. But not yet. Please, Catherine, not yet." The truce forged on the balcony was a fragile, unspoken thing. It was not friendship, but a wary alliance, a recognition of a shared burden. Kate became, in the weeks that followed, an unexpected shield for the Queen. At public events, she subtly positioned herself to draw attention away when the king faltered. She engaged Camilla in pointed conversations on the balcony, the very pictures of unity that the press ate up, giving the world the image of a harmonious, transitionary royal family. The "did you see it" moment was now retrofitted in the public mind as the beginning of a beautiful bond, a touching display of the new princess consoling the Queen. They played their parts to perfection, but the secret did not remain solely theirs. William, ever his mother's son, and felt the weight of the deception pressing on his conscience. He could not bear the thought of his children growing up in a world where the truth about their grandfather was a state secret, managed for public consumption. It felt too much like the past repeating itself. One evening, just before the Christmas Eve celebrations at Sandringham, he confronted his father privately in the king's study. It was a difficult, raw conversation between a son and his father, not a prince and his monarch. He told Charles what Kate had seen, what they both now knew. The king listened in silence, his face aging before William's eyes. He didn't deny it. He simply nodded, a long, slow acknowledgement of defeat. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known for longer than your stepmother realizes. I wasn't ready to let go of the dream." That Christmas at Sandringham was the most poignant in living memory. The king, briefed by his sons and his wife, seemed determined to soak up every moment. He led the walk to church, his pace slow but his head held high. He read the lesson, his voice clear and strong, a final, magnificent performance. And Camilla stood by his side, not as a scheming queen, but as a wife, her hand frequently reaching for his, her eyes never leaving his face. On Christmas night, after the younger members of the family had retired to bed, Kate found Camilla alone in the long gallery, looking out at the snow-dusted Norfolk grounds. The older woman turned as she entered, and for the first time, there was no wariness in her eyes, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. "Thank you," Camilla said simply. Kate shook her head. "I did nothing." "You gave me time," Camilla replied. "You gave him this, a last Christmas as king, in his own mind, in the world's mind. It is more than I ever dared to hope for." Kate walked to stand beside her, looking out at the same starry sky. The palace, with all its ancient stones and darker secrets, no longer quivered with the threat of collapse. It stood firm, but only because two very different women, bound by love for the same two men, had chosen to bear its weight together. The concealed secret was now a shared secret, and in sharing, its power to destroy had been neutralized, transformed into a strange, sad, and enduring bond. The truce held, not because of duty, but because of a quiet, mutual respect born in the crucible of a private agony, a silent promise whispered on a cold balcony, far from the flash of cameras and the roar of the crowd.